Welcome to another episode of Reasonable Discourse. I'm Terry Young, and this is my colleague Shawn McAvoy. And while you're watching us today, we're going to talk about who might just be watching you. As today we discuss the National Security Agency, government surveillance, and efforts to keep us safe. Shawn, before we get to our discussion about recent issues that popped up with government surveillance of American citizens, can you give us some historical background of situations where the government has sometimes perhaps infringed upon the rights of Americans, or arguably have infringed upon the rights of Americans in order to keep the country safe, so to speak?
Well, I can definitely go into instances where the government has engaged in such actions. Whether or not they kept Americans safe, of course, is a matter of debate. You can go all the way back to the 1790s with the Alien and Sedition Acts, when we were possibly about to go to war with France in what's called the Quasi-War. When we were having an undeclared naval war, we were afraid the French were going to invade the United States. We called George Washington out to be commander-in-chief one last time. And we put in a series of laws that made criticizing the government a crime. Also, of course, that meant we were combing the newspapers necessarily to see if you were criticizing the government. In fact, Benjamin Franklin's grandson died in prison, awaiting trial for sedition for that very reason.
And of course, there was a lot of political motivation behind the Alien and Sedition Acts, which elicited a strong response from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Then we get into the 19th century, and Abraham Lincoln kind of tramples upon the Constitution, doesn't he?
Depending on your point of view, I suppose, although it wasn't just Lincoln. Lincoln does suspend habeas corpus in the entire United States. By about 1863, it doesn't exist anywhere. There is the government watching and making sure you're not committing any acts that are considered seditious against the United States. But the Confederacy is doing the same thing. By 1863, Jefferson Davis has essentially put the Confederate States under martial law. So what we consider constitutional liberties is dead in both halves of the United States from about 63 to 65, or actually a little further beyond. So we do have an old tradition of it, and we did it again in the First World War.
Okay, sure. And it seems like every time it's on the basis of national security. We had the Espionage and Sedition Acts in World War I. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the Espionage Act was a way that we would prevent you from causing the troops to question what they were doing in the war, carrying any information that might help the enemy, or saying anything, doing anything, writing anything that might cause a soldier to question the government and their orders could get you put into prison. And then you get to the Sedition Acts in 1918, and any speech, writing that causes anybody to question the government or any criticism of the U.S. government, the flag, the Congress, was 5 to 20 years in prison, which would shut down pretty much all of our media outlets today.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we would think just on the surface that you talk about in the 18th century, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and then in the 20th century, the Espionage and Sedition Acts as being laws that seem to clearly violate freedom of the press, freedom of speech, yet in both cases, courts upheld those laws as being constitutional, in part because the Federalist judges were ruling on the legislation in the late 1790s, and then a famous U.S. Supreme Court case, Schneck versus United States, that came up with this doctrine of a clear and present danger justified those statutes. It seems like the only time that the court kind of bucked the system was when Chief Justice Roger Taney called into question the constitutionality of Abraham Lincoln's decisions, and then was threatened with imprisonment by Lincoln. So,
Lincoln considered arresting the Supreme Court.
so even as we go through the 20th century, then we get into World War II, and then we have another national security issue that results in basically the incarceration of a significant number of Americans just because of their ancestry. What happened there?
Executive Order 9066, in which we order over 120,000 Japanese into concentration camps.
Well, actually Americans, right, of Japanese ancestry.
Depends on how you look at it. The Americans at the time to the Japanese,
right.
They were American citizens, many of them second generation. They were thrown into the concentration camps. Depending on how they answered a questionnaire about 1942, 43, depended if they'd go to a more stringent concentration camp at Tule Lake in California. Of course, that was an interesting situation right there. I don't recall how the courts ever got involved in that one, but we also have at the time, I don't know if you can speak to this, the 1940 Smith Act, in which the United States starts to really clamp down on what it considers sedition.
Right, it greatly expands that, yeah.
Yeah, but the courts in 1957 dismantle that.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems like sometimes in the midst of threats to national security or perceived threats to national security, that not only do you have Congress, or in the case of the Japanese internment, the executive branch, acting in a fairly radical way, but it seems like often the courts that are supposed to determine the constitutionality of those acts seem to go along with that. And for the Executive Order 9066, there were a couple of cases, the most famous Korematsu versus the United States, which upheld the constitutionality of that act. Now, in retrospect, we look back at those things, and we see sort of the wrongfulness of some of those things. In fact, in the 1980s, many of those who had been interned received compensation for being wronged by their country. And also worth mentioning that during World War II, the most highly decorated combat unit was the 442nd.
442nd Combat Battalion, Japanese Americans who are fighting for their country while their families are in concentration camps by that very country they're fighting for.
Yeah, so we look back, so we've talked about the historical context, so we can look back and see where as a country we seemingly have made some decisions that are a bit radical, that seem to undermine constitutional liberties in the name of national security. And now let's go forward to the situation that we are dealing with now with the massive amounts of data that the government is collecting on American citizens. When did this all get kicked into gear in the 21st century?
Well, the story, in a way, goes back to the fallout from Watergate. 1978, you get the creation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, because it was noticed that, especially during the Nixon administration, wiretapping was getting out of control. The FBI was spying on whomever it wanted to. Hoover pretty much knew what you were doing at any given time of day, so we had to control it. We now have this court that has to approve wiretaps on a case-by-case basis. But that starts breaking down by the 1990s, and it kicks into high gear, of course, with 9/11.
Sure.
By October, we're undoing that.
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting that because we've heard about the stories of the FBI, of Hoover, and Martin Luther King Jr., John Lennon. I mean, you name anyone that.
Bobby Kennedy,
right, which is interesting. The Attorney General, that they were subject to those sorts of surveillance and things that would seemingly be illegal. But you're right. We have 9/11, September 11, 2001, and then within a matter of 6 weeks, we passed the Patriot Act. And I don't know about you. You might be able to recall what the acronym. It's actually it's an abbreviation. The Patriot Act, the USA Patriot Act, and each letter stands for something I couldn't begin to tell you.
And to be perfectly honest, I couldn't tell you.
But what does that law do as far as surveillance and things along those lines to American citizens?
Well, it does a lot of things, quite honestly. The main portion that relates to the surveillance that we're dealing with is Section 215.
Right.
And Section 215 is what really establishes the legality for the federal government to surveil phone records, to surveil any sort of electronic communications that might somehow negatively impact American security. And to do that using American citizens' records, phone calls, whatnot, is allowed. Then Section 215 later gets incorporated into the U.S. Code. Now we're stuck with it as 50 U.S.C. 1861, I believe.
And it's since, and of course, this happened initially under the administration of George W. Bush, but Barack Obama also extended Section 215, the significant provisions of the Patriot Act. And I guess although there have been stories from various news sources since the enactment of the Patriot Act about some of the data collection, we really don't know its scope until Edward Snowden comes along. So what happened with that?
He basically lets us know, and everyone has an opinion on whether what Snowden did was right or not. Well, that's your opinion. Genie's out of the bottle now, so we have to deal with it. He comes along, and we start getting the revelations by really mid to late 2013 that the surveillance is not just cell phone calls, it's using the GPS in cell phones to track your actual location daily. It is following texts, messages, mobile apps, even revelation that online video gaming has been used, that webcams on your laptop can be secretly turned on by the NSA to watch you doing whatever you're doing while you're on the computer. It seems to have completely ballooned into, honestly, what we probably should have expected to start with.
Yeah, and really some of that stuff I think is just so Orwellian, I guess, that it's kind of hard to believe. And you know, there have been a number of administrative or executive orders, and you mentioned FISA court decisions that I know there's one in 2002 called the raw take data. Prior to that time, things that were not pertinent to investigations into terrorist activities had to be filtered out if it was private information. That order, that decision changed that. So basically, unfiltered data, no matter how private, no matter how irrelevant it might be to terrorist activities, all that information gets shared between the NSA and the FBI and the CIA. So how should we feel as American citizens with the knowledge that we have of what is occurring at the government level as far as how they surveil the things that we do?
How should we feel? The way we're told to feel. We're good at that. The government tells us how to feel, we follow suit. I have to admit, it's interesting to me watching things going on like in Ukraine. Russia invades the Crimea after a popular revolution has overthrown the president. They were angry at that president for a lot less than the reasons we have to be angry. Egypt's gone through 2 revolutions since 2011. How should we feel about surveillance? Obviously, we're not feeling strongly enough to want to do anything other than complain about it on television or talk radio.
Well, I thought it was interesting that Dianne Feinstein, senator from California, who is involved with Foreign Intelligence Committee, that Senate Intelligence Committee, was very indignant about the fact that the CIA may be spying on members of the U.S. Senate, but yet she's been very defensive of the program as it relates to U.S. citizens. I thought that was kind of strange.
Oh, just a little bit of your standard hypocrisy in Congress. Right. Nothing to be bothered with.
Right. Shawn, is the fact that maybe this hasn't sparked more outrage from Americans, as much skepticism as a lot of people seem to have about our government, isn't there still this general belief that we believe the government's looking out for our best interests and that they want to keep us safe? I mean, isn't that why we're willing to show our world to some body looking at through a camera as we go through the airport and have a full body scan and things like that? We're willing to do those things in the name of security. Do you think that's why there's not as much outrage about this?
No, it's possible. There's another possibility, though, which is actually more disturbing, and it could just be that so many Americans are opting out of the society. We've seen it before, and historically, you go to like the 3rd century Roman Empire. Large portion of the population just give up. The government's not even worth fighting for anymore. I do see some of that in the United States. You get more revelations that your privacy's been breached, your rights are gone, and people's attitude is, well, what's the point? This government's corrupt anyway, the country's going, so, I'm not even going to bother to fight for it.
This is sort of a little more dirt on the pile, right? Not anything to get too upset about.
Now, I want to ask you a question.
Sure.
I'm curious, as an historian, because we've talked about how this program, it starts to ramp up under George W. Bush. But in a way, it really picks up steam in 2009 after Obama gets into office, even though he had a tendency to campaign against it. Do you see any difference in the way these 2 presidents are doing surveillance or using the surveillance?
That's a good question. I think a lot of things that Barack Obama as a candidate promised to do away with when he became president, suddenly those things were far more appealing to him because, for example, shutting down Guantanamo. I mean, I think he famously issues the executive order very early on in his time in office that, Guantanamo will be shut down within a year, and then there are lots of complications about that. And I think from a political standpoint, I think that Barack Obama probably realized that, we are doing all these things as a country under the argument, the assertion to keep Americans safe. I get rid of some of these programs, and then we have a terrorist attack. What are the political consequences of that? And so I think that's why that there's been hesitancy to back away from some of these surveillance programs and so on. And you said he ramped up some things. I mean, we think about the number of drone attacks that have been carried out far exceed those that have been carried out under the Bush administration.
Yeah, Bush, I believe, had 52 drone attacks. Obama has so far 303, I think was the last count.
Yeah, and you and I have had this discussion in the process. American citizens have been targeted and in Yemen have killed without any due process. And there was a little bit of discussion about that, but not a lot when that happened. And I think it kind of goes back to the idea that no one's going to have sympathy for terrorists, but how do we know someone's a terrorist?
Yeah, and it's interesting because what do you have operating here? Okay, granted, it's 4 Americans. They're working with terrorists. Let's assume that they all were. Well, that would be treason against the United States. The Constitution's very clear about how we could take care of that, and they probably would be convicted in, a 20-minute jury trial.
Right.
It still leaves us with a very distasteful result, that the President of the United States can execute an American citizen without any due process. He can simply sign an order, and you're dead.
Yeah, and now, again, the reason I don't think that drew a lot of attention is that folks would say the government can make the argument, and they did make the argument, that there was no way to arrest these individuals considering where they were located. The only way to bring them to justice safely without endangering American military lives would be to use the drone attacks. But we always have to look at we have to look at that slippery slope. If it's okay in this situation, essentially it's execution without a trial. So, again, not many folks are going to have a lot of sympathy for someone who all the evidence seems to indicate was involved in terrorist activities against the country. But if we look at our Constitution, clearly that's not something that falls within the purview of what the President can do without violating the Constitution.
Yeah, you could also say, if you look in the Constitution, what do you do with the Fourth Amendment? American citizens have the right to not have an unwarranted or unreasonable search and seizure of their persons, their homes, whatnot. Doesn't the NSA violate that? It's been noticed even in the Inspector's General report that went through 5 federal agencies and determined, I think it was in 2009, maybe it was 13, that the NSA spying program is probably a massive violation of the Fourth Amendment. And
there's actually been a couple of cases that have dealt with that. One case out of Federal District Court in Washington, D.C., I think it was the Clayman versus Obama case. The judge actually used the language probably violates the Fourth Amendment. And then we had a case with the ACLUs versus Clapper, where in a different federal district, different outcome. So that has not been resolved. But one of the things that I think the judge mentioned in the Clayman case is that there is no evidence that this data mining, this massive amount of data being collected by NSA, has actually prevented any terrorist attacks.
That also came out in the Inspector General's report as well, where they had mentioned that they could find no convincing evidence that any of the information collected has helped at all at breaking up one terrorist cell or preventing one terrorist attack. Yet the program was expanded after that report came out.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's the troubling thing and the tough thing to deal with. I mentioned going through the X-ray machine before you board a flight and doing those sorts of things. I mean, certainly those things are an inconvenience, and if the pictures ever get out on the internet of us going through those screenings, would be hugely embarrassing. But I think most Americans are willing to do those sorts of things with the idea, look, if this makes this flight safer, and they can point to incidents in the past, obviously 9/11 and then the shoe bomber and things like that, where maybe those sorts of incidents are being prevented because of this. But when you talk about giving up your privacy to your phone calls, to anything on your computer and any sort of communications, and yet the government can't prove that that's doing anything to keep us safer, I think I'm surprised that more people aren't troubled by that.
No, and it does bring up an excellent question in my mind. If the American people don't seem to care about any of this, well, then is it really right to fault the politicians? Dianne Feinstein makes a hypocritical stand in the Senate. Who cares? Obama expands the program. Big deal. Apparently the Americans have no problem with it.
And I don't think you're going to see very many folks, again, I go back to, I think, the political reasons why Obama has sort of continued many of the programs that he was critical of as a candidate. Imagine someone running for Congress or for the U.S. Senate who wants to do away with these programs. In certain states that, where there are a lot of civil libertarians, that may work. But if we have, God forbid, another terrorist attack or something occurs, and you are the politician leading the charge against the NSA or the CIA or the FBI, what's that going to look like, I guess? And I think because of that, I think that sort of really hinders some of the politicians from coming out and saying, this is a violation of civil liberties. This is not something we need in America. I just think that's probably a very politically dangerous thing to do.
And in fact, with that in mind, do you think we're going to see a president anytime in the near future who will actually dismantle the surveillance program?
Yeah. I think unless there's more outrage by the American people, where it becomes politically pragmatic to dismantle this, I'm not sure we'll see a lot happen. So I guess to an extent it's probably up to all of us as citizens, if we're upset about how much information the government has access to and the surveillance that they're carrying out and the phone calls and things like that, then it's going to take a little more outrage so that there's some political power behind that before we see changes, I think.
Yeah, and I think also Americans need to understand that they don't always keep in mind we've had terrorist attacks throughout our history.
Sure.
It's not something brand new in 9/11. I'm often amazed at how many people all of a sudden have discovered Islam. Not that Islam's to blame for 9/11 in and of itself, but all of a sudden at 9/11 they discover there's a Muslim world. Well, wait a minute. What happened to the Munich Olympics?
Right.
That was a terrorist act.
Right.
What about Muammar Gaddafi in Libya for about 20 years?
Right.
You can go back to the Haymarket bomb.
Sure. Anarchists in Chicago in the 1880s. So,
exactly.
Wall Street was bombed in 1919 by an anarchist. So
we're going to have terrorism, honestly, for as long as this country exists. Is that really an excuse?
Yeah.
To keep these programs in place indefinitely?
Well, folks, this is a very complex topic. Encourage you to, don't take our word for it. Go out and read all you can about these NSA programs and the Patriot Act and things that have been going on. I don't know if Shawn and I have been under constant surveillance, but we probably will be after this. I don't know.
Oh, don't worry about it. You're sitting in a room with me. They already have been checking you out. I'm a known danger.
Thank you, folks, for watching us, and we've hoped we've enlightened you a little bit about this subject. Thank you very much.
Have a good evening.